Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us for the July edition of Renew Canada's Infra Intelligence Discussion Series. Today's topic will be designing infrastructure for disruptive events. I'm your host, Andrew Macklin, Managing Editor of Renew Canada, with you once again to moderate today's conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on what I'm sure is a very busy Thursday morning for many of you. We appreciate you taking the time for what I know will be an excellent 90-minute conversation. We've got four speakers that we hope to have join us for today's conversation, and we greatly look forward to having the conversation with you today. Before we get too far into things, I would just want to remind you, if you've been with us before, you probably know all about the functionality that comes with joining us for a crowdcast event. However, if you haven't joined us before, I want to point out that there are lots of ways for you to take part in today's conversation. First of all, you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen the chat box. I encourage everyone to please comment in the chat, introduce yourself to everyone who is joining us today, tell people where you're from, what you're hoping to learn. You'll also see that there is information posted by our parent company, Actual Media, regarding everybody who is taking part in today's conversation. We encourage you to tweet about the things that you hear today during our discussion, and please tag Design Infra as the hashtag for today's event, and be sure to tag all of our partners and speakers who are participating today. You'll also see that there's lots of opportunity for you to ask questions and to take part in our poll. So just want to direct you to the bottom of your screen. You'll see that there is a poll tab on the bottom of your screen. Throughout today's discussion, we'll be posting polls that will ask you questions about your knowledge on the subject of designing infrastructure for disruptive events, as well as other key topics affiliated to today's discussion. I do very much want to encourage you to please take the time to participate in those polls, as that extra information helps us create a more robust deliverable from today's event. You'll also see that there's an opportunity for you to ask a question. If you click on that tab and type in your question, you'll have the opportunity to have that asked by me as I moderate this morning's conversation. As well, you'll see that when you open the Ask a Question section, you'll see that on the left-hand side of each question, there's a voting function. If you click on that, that allows me to see that you also want to ask a question that's already been asked by somebody else. Makes me realize that, yes, this question is a priority because there are multiple people in the conversation that are looking for an answer. Lastly, you'll see at the bottom of the screen, there's a little green tab that says Renew Canada currently. Throughout the 90-minute discussion, there will be different links for both myself and the rest of our speakers participating today. That will allow you to go live to their websites. It will pull it up in another tab, and you'll be able to see some of the great work that so many of our panelists today are involved in their own individual companies. Also want to remind you that within a few short hours of today's discussion taking place, you will be able to come right back to this link to be able to watch the video again on demand at any time you see fit. So if you've got a colleague who you know would really like to watch this conversation but doesn't get an opportunity to be able to be part of the live discussion because they're in meetings or on the job site, never fear, there is an opportunity to watch this conversation at a later date. As well, there will be some post-event deliverables that will be brought forward by Renew Canada, both a news story in the coming days on our website, renewcanada.net, which is the live link you'll see at the bottom of your screen right now. And as well, you can expect a full-length feature on this discussion in the November-December edition of Renew Canada. One last thing before we invite our panelists to join me here live, I do want to thank Logistec. For those of you who aren't familiar with Logistec, I would encourage you to go to their website and check out the work they are doing here in Canada. They have graciously supported today's event, and we do want to thank them for supporting today's conversation, one that we think is very important and not getting the kind of attention that it is due, which is why we are here today. So, I think you've heard enough from me. I think it's time for us to dive headfirst into our conversation. We have four excellent speakers that we hope, depending on the greatness of the connectivity, depending on where all these fine folks are, we hope that we have four speakers that would be able to join our conversation. And I'm going to quickly let you know who each of them are. First of all, Martin Bureau. Martin is a professional engineer who has been working in research and development since 1992. He holds a doctorate of material sciences in polymer composites, a master's in applied sciences in metallurgy, and a bachelor of engineering in metallurgy. He joined Sanexen in 2013 as senior director of research and development and is now vice president of innovation. His primary responsibilities consist of supporting the growth of the infrastructure and environment divisions, as well as of affiliate company Needner Incorporated, through the development and introduction of new products and processes, including intellectual property management. Martin also acts as an expert in the process development and manufacturing for Sanexen's needs. He has extensive experience in manufacturing processes, process structure, performance relationships, and the mechanical behavior of composites, polymers, and foams, which he gained at the National Research Council of Canada between 1998 and 2012. Martin, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Our second speaker to join us is Rory Baksh. Rory has over 21 years of experience in growth management, official plan reviews, and municipal comprehensive reviews, environmental and social impact assessment, strategic environmental assessment, climate change, and social advancement. Rory has extensive experience in policy analysis, land use planning, long-range infrastructure planning, institutional strengthening, and stakeholder consultation. He has designed and implemented numerous public engagements for a wide range of community-based and strategic projects and is currently a partner with Dillon Consulting. Rory, thank you for joining us today.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
John Howe is a thought leader and strategy advisor at Wood. John is a transportation financing, investment, and project evaluation executive. He is a subject matter expert, thought, and influence leader. He has 20 years of experience in the public and private sectors. Prior to joining Wood, John was vice president transportation at Cole Engineering and served in senior roles at Asset Future and Parsons Brinkerhoff in the United States. Hopefully we'll have John with us shortly. And our final speaker that we are so excited, we just had her come on board for our conversation yesterday afternoon. We're really excited to have Heather Morgan. Heather Morgan oversees sustainability and risk management at AECOM's New York City office. She brings 17 plus years of experience in flood risk management, infrastructure planning, landscape architecture, and landscape archaeology, from projects focused on sustainability through climate adaptation. Heather applies a transdisciplinary strategy for redefining the relationship between our human inhabitation and the natural system. Many of her projects have required robust stakeholder and community engagement processes where she applies risk communication, risk education, and risk-informed decision-making for large-scale urban integrated civic infrastructure projects. Heather previously worked at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers headquarters in Washington, D.C. as a civil works sustainability lead and national sustainability program manager. Heather, thank you so much for joining us. Very happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. So, folks, why don't we just dive right into our conversation? And, well, let's start here. The COVID-19 pandemic has tested our resilience in a different way than a typical disruptive event, namely a natural disaster. So I'm curious, from your standpoint, were we ready for it, and did we adapt well? Martin, perhaps let's start with you on that.
Well, I don't think anyone were ready for such an event. Even in very strategic risk assessment, people just don't believe in, comet or, catastrophic situations like that. So I guess we weren't. Now, did we have tools to answer or to face the challenge? We did. Thanks for all the IT teams and all our companies and at the government and that within days or a few weeks turned a huge challenge into a mindset of solution finding, which I find amazing. So I think that could make us confident for the future that yes, we're able to face a challenge like that. But were we ready? I guess no.
Rory, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd agree that we didn't really see it coming. There are other jurisdictions in the world that have faced crises. For example, there's been the Ebola issue in Africa, which is equally as nasty as coronavirus in its ways. But the thing that we did, if you think about it, in the high tech world that we live in, was pretty much low tech. Like what we said is, quarantine yourself and social distance. And you don't need technology to stand 2 meters away from somebody. You can just do that. So it's interesting that we were able to kind of use a low-tech solution to flatten the curve. And some places did it a lot faster than we did because of their own sense of imminent danger. Like in the Caribbean, they flattened that curve very quickly. And in Canadian First Nation communities, they responded very quickly, realizing the risk that they faced, and they essentially closed their borders. And they said, we're in our bubble and we want to be safe. And so I think, there was an ability for us as a society and as communities to respond really well. And like I said, I find it interesting that it was a low-tech solution to flatten that curve.
Heather, your thoughts?
Well, I live in New York City. I'm currently in Atlanta right now due to COVID. And I would say that, no, we weren't prepared. But I would like to couch that with, I think what Martin was saying was the response to COVID at an accelerated space and pace was in the New York City region was pretty impressive. As much as we wished it wouldn't have been as reactive. I ride my bike to work. I ride the subway a lot. The last several months I've been riding the bike a lot. So I think at a personal scale, even the ability to ride your bike and know that I wasn't necessarily exposed on the subways was a jump in scale. And then working at AECOM, we had the privilege to try to help out through FEMA taskers, everything from designing alternative care facilities to working with our industrial hygienists. You mentioned Ebola, that had done work for the Ebola pandemic, and really start to unpack, well, how do you help your mayor and your governor allow us to retain our quality of life in any format, and then also protect us a little bit in the future. The scales of services and reaction in a very quick time went from building temporary alternative care facilities to writing social distancing for MTA transit, and then all the way to putting in sensors into wastewater treatment facilities so that when there's more of the virus, unfortunately, in the black water coming out of the urban context, we were able to see raising levels in the virus in human waste at the wastewater treatment facilities. So there has been a bunch of leaps and bounds, but sadly, totally not prepared. Absolutely.
Rory, I just want to quickly go back to one of the points you just made, which was about the First Nations communities across Canada that were closing their borders when the pandemic broke out. And I think one of the interesting things about that is that I think when people first heard that, they just assumed it was, those remote communities in, the northern stretches of the provinces. But then you look to even the heavily populated parts of southern Ontario, and you look at a place like the Six Nations Reserve that's, just southwest of Hamilton, biggest reserve in Ontario, and they closed basically every single road in and out of their reserve in order to, like you said, control the pandemic. I think that catches a lot of people by surprise when they realize that even nations in the more developed part of our provinces close their doors and block themselves off and make sure that they isolated themselves to try to control the pandemic.
Yeah, it's I think it boils down to community leadership, and that's one of the things that at the end of the day differentiates the communities that succeed in any situation. And as we transform and make decisions, one of the things that the practitioners in this business can do is to have a direct influence in community leaders and decision making, and to make wise choices about where we're going to now start investing to enhance our resiliency. And the group of people that are attending this webinar are some of the people that are the best equipped to do that.
Speaking of which, just a reminder, everyone that is attending the webinar, please put your name in the chat, say hello. Let's find out who all is joining us today. And don't forget, if you have a question at any time, please feel free to ask it. Martin, Heather, I didn't know if you had any comment that you wanted to add about, kind of the measures that some of these communities went to shut out their own borders to be able to control the pandemic.
Martin, do you want to go ahead?
No, please go.
I guess I can just talk about firsthand in New York City. Immediately buildings, we have high density, obviously. Our personal building, you had to ask for permission to leave if you were diagnosed or had any symptoms. You couldn't, throw out your own trash. You couldn't walk your own dog. So I think that as much as New York City is dense and has, high demographic amounts and diverse demographics, everyone was kind of isolating in the way of the community that you said, but it was at the scale of everyone's apartments or in everyone's buildings. And so that's what I can speak to, but that's about it.
Yeah, I guess education plays a big role here for people to understand what's happening and what's a good measure and what's a fake news type of measure that we hear a lot on social media, unfortunately. So that's in going forward. I believe even at in our schools, for example, there should be courses targeted on that and how to respond. Many of us don't have batteries or water reserves in our own homes. I'm ashamed to say that I don't, and many of us don't actually. So we're just not prepared for something like that, and we're not educated as well for doing something like that. And probably that's one of the consequences of our open borders. The global economy, the global village, etc. Yeah,
Martin, I want to build on what you just said because I think it's important for us when we consider that there could be a second, third, fourth wave ahead, or just being able to properly plan for disruptive events in the future. All three of you said we weren't ready for this. So I'm curious if we can maybe start to drill down. What were some of those vulnerabilities that were exposed? You just mentioned a few from the personal level, but I'm just wondering, when you take a look at some of the different sectors, what were some of the vulnerabilities that were exposed when the pandemic first hit?
Well, an obvious one was our infrastructures, and starting by a very concrete example like our streets. Sidewalks are not built in a way that we can avoid social contact, subways, buses, etc. And then our logistics. We all start working around 8, 9, depends. We're all in the subway or in traffic at the same time. We can't afford to be alone in our cars, in our big cities, at least, all of us. We're 2 million on the island of Montreal. Can't be all alone in our car because it's going to be a big highway, that island, no place for people. And then the workspace is built for exchanging the hallways and everything. So we need to think about and obviously a lot of people and we've heard that a lot in the last months, the work time at work. When do we come in? When do we leave? Why is it that we need to be all there between 8 and 5 and things like that? And more importantly, at least for us and the panelists here, infrastructures in particular, water infrastructures, transport infrastructures, rely on people, low level of automatization, lots of vulnerabilities with respect to the state of the infrastructures right now. Federal government is investing a lot of money into underground infrastructure and all infrastructures in general, but in Canada. But knowing the state of this infrastructure, half of it is in critical state. There's certainly a lot to do planning ahead, and the assessment management functions that probably AECON and other companies provide service with or for will be key in the future.
Rory?
I'm going to kind of pick up on that piece that Martin noted, which was the fact that our infrastructure, for it to be operated, it still relies very heavily on direct human interaction. And so, obviously, huge thanks and applause to our frontline workers, because there's a lot of people in infrastructure service delivery that were essential workers and had to go to work at a very, very scary time. So we are so grateful for them.
Yeah.
But if we are going to then slowly begin to move towards some of this automation and remote control and things like that, one of the things that actually did emerge, which was that was exposed, was that we are not as cyber secure as we thought we may be. For example, everybody started using Zoom, and then after a little while, Zoom got attacked. And so Zoom had to actually implement greater security measures. Some people may actually recall that. And we're still seeing, because my IT company, my IT team, feeds me information on what's happening in the cybersecurity world, is they're still seeing malware attacks. That never stopped, even though there was a global pandemic. The hackers actually said, well, we'll go easy on healthcare facilities while COVID is out there, but we'll still be hitting other industries. And they were very, gracious about that, but that continued. So, there's something there to keep in mind. Like, I think it would be an innovation to move infrastructure towards remote control, artificial intelligence, greater levels of automation. But within that, there also needs to be appropriate level of security, if things are going to be cloud-based or otherwise in terms of how we run those systems. So that's got to be super important for public health, public safety.
Heather?
Vulnerabilities that were exposed were attached to the immediate response to the pandemic. I think that's the first 3 months. That's where I spent a lot of my time working with industrial hygienists. So I think the most concise way I can say this is we were trying to look at the life cycle of the exposure and the life cycle of what we knew of for the disease, basically. So actually, it's not a disease. It's a pathogen. So anyways, if I move through that life cycle, it is, it's in the city. We're responding to it. People are getting sick. Everyone remembers the narrative surrounded around the lack of PPE, medical equipment needed to help people that have severe symptoms. But what we had to do is we had to push past that immediate fire and say, what do we do? And I don't mean to not speak about this sincerely, because this is a tough conversation, but I'm just going to streamline it for the sake of, we're all talking right now. We got to save time. But what do we do with bodies? What do we deal with bodies in high density places? When we are having the increase, unfortunately, of deceased, and we don't know what to do with the fluids in the body, how do we deal with the body bags? How many body bags do we have? How much PPE do we lose for the amount of people that have to handle the deceased and transfer them? Where do we store the deceased? Where do we have space for this? How do we get refrigerated? I'm just walking you through our life cycle. How do we get refrigerated trucks? How do you fit them in dense parts of Brooklyn, in dense parts of Manhattan? Wait a minute. Do we need incinerators on site? What about all the human and body waste for the patients and anyone treating them? Wait a minute. Do we just need crematoriums on site to stop the life cycle of everything spreading from these hotspot hospital centers to the rest of the region? Wait a minute. It stays in fecal and urine matter for several days. This is every time it rains, this is going into our combined sewer overflow problem and expending out into our ecosystem, or what's left of the ecosystem in New York City. And when you start mounting that over maybe 5 days of talking, I mean, you're talking accelerated pace of discourse between us and the stakeholders and our clients we were trying to help, you start really seeing how vulnerable you are. And in addition to the great points that Martin and Rory are saying. And one of the things is that we have to continue to land plan and understand when we have pandemics, what we kind of rested at as a very conceptual option was regional hospitals that are specifically activated when a pandemic happens, where you have the room to treat the life cycle of the disease, as well as people that have to stay there around the clock. You mentioned quality of life for workers in transit. MTA employees were hit massively. There was a lot of information there for the family members that lost their families that were working in the transit environment. And then the taking care of the medical staff and trying to create like a campus so that if they can't go home to their families, Well, how do we provide them a good environment where they actually get the psychological recharge to go back into the emergency center? So that's just, I know that's a lot of scale jumping there, but that's the level of vulnerability that we were seeing, that we need so many people to help out. I mean, if you want something new to look at, or you need a new passion at any level, academic, elementary school, it doesn't matter. There's a world of improvement there that we could all work in and help each other out. So that's what I saw.
And it's very interesting because I don't think traditionally, because we're more stuck in the roles that we have, that we think that far back and that many steps. Because I mean, Heather, it took you about 7 steps, but eventually you got to the, where we are, which is what are the impacts on infrastructure? And suddenly it's like, oh my gosh, there were so many steps that impacted so many people, that led up to this significant problem that we're now dealing with our infrastructure. And Martin, I mean, I know you deal a lot in the water space. Canada didn't quite get hit to the level that, say, a place like New York City got hit, but were those concerns there within our own water system to be able to handle these new impacts that we were seeing through the pandemic?
Yeah, I believe they were all considered, and again, we weren't prepared for that, and they went through the whole cycle. I'd like to remind the audience that while Canada was not that it, Montreal and my own neighborhood in particular, Ansic, was severely hit to our own. We're about 100,000 population here, so and we had several hundred deaths in this neighborhood in particular. So we had to deal with that. Now, 100, I'm sorry, and it's not my area of expertise, but 100 casualties is not the same as several thousands in terms of the challenges that Heather referred to. But coming closer to what we do at Logistec and Sanexen, imagine that the same consequences came from a different type of event, a natural disaster, for example, whether it's a tsunami, which is highly probable in Montreal or Vancouver or New York, a earthquake, or simply massive flooding like we had on the Montreal Island or in Alberta or elsewhere throughout North America, but to another level, a very important level, where then you have all the health care and the casualties that come with it. We simply are not prepared for that, and our government don't seem to, at least so far, they haven't looked into that much, at least to our level. I mean, we manage network, we repair water networks, and asset management is a function within municipalities that we have very little access to. Few cities have leadership, but most of them, no word on the game. So there's definitely, that's going to be a eye opener in risk management. And for us, it's going to be logistics, it's going to be infrastructure, underground infrastructure. For others, it's going to be healthcare and so on. And we need to repair that. We need to strengthen, make it more resilient. Sea levels will rise. Lower Manhattan will be underwater. And within a few decades, all their underground is below the sea level. So, and this is so far not addressed. There are technologies available for that. While people still think, let's say, mainstream conventional solutions, we need to change that.
If I could build off Heather and Martin's observations, Andrew.
Of course.
One of the things that's also a vulnerability, kind of connecting the dots here, is when we think of kind of day-to-day infrastructure, we're thinking about municipal infrastructure. And generally, that's one of the biggest line items in any municipality's budget. And I've done a lot of work in asset management. And there's 2 prevailing philosophies. And in the context of this conversation, they're a bit scary, because one philosophy says bigger is better, and the other philosophy says do more with less. And neither of those philosophies work from a resiliency perspective, because what you need to be able to be resilient, connecting the dots from the things Heather and Martin were saying, is you actually need backup systems. And you need to be able to invest in those, and you have to plan and program for that. And that's a bit of a paradigm shift from the way that we've been looking at infrastructure for a very, very long time. And so there's, I think, something that's also exposed. We've exposed a philosophy about how we plan and manage infrastructure and how we distribute infrastructure, because we tend to look at centralized large-scale networks as being more economically efficient. But in fact, what they are is they're uber non-resilient as a result of that. And so I think there's some movement there for the world to make around infrastructure.
And Heather, I know this is some of this is right up your alley, because I know the kind of flood resilience and flood mitigation work that you're doing in the New York City area. And I'm just wondering if you can build on what Martin and Rory have said.
Yeah, I think that, it's interesting. In New York, we have the luxury of a high dense situation. So a lot of what we would design and build is economically justified. I think that, I don't know, if I was to pull back and say what I've noticed the most is that we, at AECOM, I get the luxury to work with a lot of really good engineers, landscape architects, ecologists, you name it, asset managers. And in moving from a federal agency to the private sector, one of the reasons that I did that was because the private sector had more agility in the US. And I think that when we're looking at these cities and when we're looking at ways to unpack them, the designers can circle and look at these solutions, but until we've actually allowed the public to be empowered by them understanding how their natural system is changing, the narrative is, this is something that's happening to me. Whereas if you can empower your general public, the people that come to your community meetings, I always say that I'm not successful unless my 11-year-old niece understands my coastal surge model, right? Because the thing is that, you want people to you want people to feel that they've been given information that empowers them, that they can do something about what's happening. And that means if a community feels empowered, no matter their resource limitations, then they can see themselves in it and they can figure out how they want to be a part of it at whatever level that it is. And so that to me is, I know this is a little bit more, most of the feedback's been about design and infrastructure and stuff, but I really think it comes down to risk communication. Well, a lot of things, this is one aspect, risk communication and risk education, and then building trust by talking very transparently about those vulnerabilities and how we can unpack that risk. I think that's where the culture of climate adaptation's got to go. We've got to move it out of the scientific justification and put it in mediums so that people can see it and validate what they're seeing themselves. I was just yesterday talking about a project down in Beaufort County, South Carolina. I'm not working on it. It was just a phone call for me to advise on it. It was another company, actually. And one of the things I said to them on the community meeting was, maybe have during a COVID environment where you can't have a huge meeting where everyone comes, maybe 2 weeks in advance, offer those communities to take pictures of where they see rain and residual flooding and nuisance flooding happening where it never used to have in their yard. Or like allow people to validate climate change for them on their terms and let them bring that to you. Because it's going to be a combination of everything that we're doing, but I think the cultural influence and education is a huge factor of what we're dealing with, that maybe as designers we might stay away from, because sometimes it's uncomfortable, not easy.
So an interesting question that's come in that actually builds on what you just said, and it's going to kind of distract us maybe a little bit, and I'll get us back onto the road of designing infrastructure. And to our panelists, this is very much an opinion-based question. So comfort level for all three of you. If it's there, great. If it's not, don't worry about it. But the question is, the role that municipal government plays is often overlooked in our society. Voter turnout is often below 50% for elections, while people take municipal services like water, sewer, and waste collection for granted. Do you think COVID-19 will increase our interest or investment in municipal governments moving forward?
Yeah, I'll jump on that one. I think as we've learned as a society, like humans are super smart, but we're stupid at the same time. And I say that as a joke because we're stupid because sometimes we need like a critical event in order to hit the wake up call. And I think like Hurricane Katrina was like the first big critical event for the United States to say, OMG, what the heck's going on with regards to how we're managing flooding in this country, right? And public safety and so on and so forth. That was their big OMG moment. So I think now as a group of communities, as infrastructure planners, as infrastructure managers, as the voice of learned wisdom to the decision makers, this is a huge opportunity for us to step up and have leadership and say, look, the lack of resiliency has been exposed. The historic approaches to decision making about how we fund, plan, and design our infrastructure have come clear. If anyone's looking for the great experiment to prove it, we've just been through it and it's been proven. And so let's start looking at a different way and let's start changing the dialogue. And I think there's a lot of work to be done. Heather's touched on it, but I think there's a lot of public relations, public communication that infrastructure groups have to embrace, whether you're in the private sector or the public sector. The question was around municipality. So, if you're in the public sector, I think there's something really important that you have to do. If you're the director of an infrastructure agency, PR is going to be one of your most important things, getting the message out there that people need to look at infrastructure differently and they need to be supportive of funding infrastructure and communicating more clearly to leaders that this is absolutely necessary and it's part of the priority. The good news is we've been on a bit of a track with asset management, and it's been a door opener for the conversation. So we're not starting from ground zero, but this is a huge opportunity to really, put some strength and focus to the need for investment and to raise awareness that the fact that I can turn on my tap and get fresh water is something that we all take for granted and we should be a lot more mindful of.
Sure.
Martin, Heather, did one of you two want to build on Rory's comments?
Yes, Heather, you want to start first?
I think that my country right now is showcasing a lot of what COVID has illuminated in social inequalities, and it's I think there's a silver lining, like kind of what Rory is saying, that it's unfortunate it takes a hot probe, to allow our culture to advance. I think that one of the things is that this understanding where your land use and your access to technology, all of this is amplifying the impacts to COVID. And another layer is obviously climate change. Our heat indexing tends to be in lower income neighborhoods where there's window units instead of, central heat and air that's not allowing the urban streets to cool at nighttime in the summer. A lot of those areas don't have as many trees. I mean, it's the same neighborhoods that have higher climate impacts are also the same neighborhoods that were resource limited during COVID. And I think that it's a really good time in our country to have honest discourse around that, and whatever field you're in, to really understand that we can't, nor should we, but we can't sustain, like Rory is saying, the way in which things are going. Opinion-wise, I'll just let the people in the country that are being rather vocal kind of represent right now how I think that the tone in this country and the direction we should go. I'll let them speak for me. They're doing a good job and they're being real loud. How's that?
Yeah. I won't go there. Yeah, building on what Rory said, I kind of lost track with this comment. Well, first thing, in Montreal, the mayor, this administration took the leadership and made some changes. Some people like, some people don't, but they decided that they would close half the streets and get lanes for pedestrians as well as cycling lanes throughout the city. We now have a network of a cycling lane that's as large as Denmark, not Denmark, but the capital of Denmark.
Copenhagen?
Thank you, Copenhagen. All things being compared the same. And so they tried to use this big event as an experiment and make some changes. And that is triggering, I think, the reaction that Rory referred to as do less or do more with less. While you have those streets, there's fewer traffic. Why don't we allow people to move? And I believe that for technology providers like us, this is going to trigger a mindset or a change in mindset where we're pushing technology a lot. Our Aquapipe technology makes a network resilient. It can survive earthquakes, but yet it's very difficult to penetrate the American market. Lots of conservatism in throughout the cities. Every city is supposedly different, but at the same time, they're always the same pipe. So few places have adopted technology like that, and I believe that now I hope, and I think we're not going to be in so much a technology push mode than a market pull or a community pull. Like guys, mayors, municipal administrations, find some solutions. We can't be exposed like we are right now. And building on your example of opening the tap and getting fresh water and clean water and safe water, well, that's far from being secured for the future. The investments in the States alone for the water systems is in the level of hundreds of billions in the next few years, and all cities are broke. How do you fix that? So solutions for doing more with less will be attractive. Hopefully, resilient solution will be adopted, and there'll be opportunities for consultants, for solution providers, for municipal administrators to shine and win.
Another question that's come in that I think builds on Rory, your comments, which is generally crisis drives action. However, most in short term. Any suggestions on how to maintain the momentum and interest in mitigating risks and vulnerabilities after the crisis? Well,
Andrew, I might argue that the short term for COVID is going to be a little bit longer term than the past. Like we have not seen something hit the world in this way since, for example, like a world war or that Spanish flu pandemic that hit around, I think it was around 1917 or 18 or something like that. Like this is pretty big. This is of global significance. And the other thing, unlike climate change, is it touched absolutely everybody. It was felt, right at home. And so I don't think it's going to disappear from memory that quickly. And I think to the extent that as it relates to the future of infrastructure, we can harness that and we can make it part of the dialogue and keep it in the dialogue. Then I think we can do it. I don't believe that once we're out of this pandemic, that the reminder of COVID is going to go away. Like there's a generation now that is beginning to die off, and that generation is the last of those who lived through the Second World War. And their behaviors still at the age of 90 something are indicative of the way that they behaved during those war years.
Definitely.
So that's the extent of how a global crisis plugs into someone's behavior and their mindset. So I think, I don't believe really that COVID is going to disappear into the background, and there's going to be something else that will be top of mind. I don't know that the iPhone 12 is going to replace the significance of COVID, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. Such a good point. I've been involved in many SWOT analysis, strength, weakness, opportunities, and threat. And when you do those, the threat part, they're really generally quite concrete. You see them coming, you know what they are, you can prepare for them. And all those disaster threats, you always say, "Wow, there won't be a comet hitting us." But actually, that is completely changed. And for a few generations, people will have. So, what about the pandemic? What about the earthquake? What about that massive flooding? What about et cetera, et cetera? We've seen massive fires into urban communities in Alberta and elsewhere in North America, in California, a lot. So that's going to change for decades, for sure. So short term, I agree with you, Rory. It's not short term anymore.
Heather?
Let's see. Yeah. So if I was to try to tack a little bit more like how you plan or what are the effects after the crisis, I think what I mentioned earlier about your land planning responsibilities towards understanding what your hospital and healthcare resources are is massive. I think your manufacturing and production and storing and staging, equipment for a pandemic is a planning activity that I think is something that people are working on now. But say we do get some form of recovery from this and a treatment, maybe a vaccine at some point, there's just going to be another one that comes. I think we all know that. So I think there's a lot of responsibility in planning for the next one that has to actually happen. I think also green space in cities, I think really putting a priority and understanding that human and their quality of life in dense urban environments not only need the green space for their own psychological well-being, but now they need it for the social distancing as well. So I think that that's another new elevated priority that's always been something that's been kind of greenwashed. It's like, oh, those green spaces are for the people like the Loraxes from Dr. Seuss. And it's like, no, those are now for like much more an elevated and severe needs, not just because you like it. The other thing that I would say is that I think the caretaking and responsibility culturally, globally, the fact that the world is more globalized, we're basically a trade and commerce Pangea now. I think Elizabeth Colbert covers this also from an ecosystem standpoint. And the fact that there's a lot of responsibility that just an individual person needs to take into account. Where do you buy your goods from? Where are you transporting yourself to? Where are people coming from? And not that people need to be paranoid about that, but I think we all need to be educated and understand the interdependencies that can arrive and the risks, right? Politicizing wearing a mask. I would really like to see that not be something that happens in the future for any pandemic, something like politicizing medical treatment. That's something that I think can be done pretty easily if we could get around that bend for some reason. And then I think climate change is like a common denominator that impacts everybody. And COVID is in that same envelope, right? And so I think that we really need to seriously look at the degradation of our natural systems and our biodiversity and start to really pay attention to people that are really starting to put a lot of information out there that, reducing our natural habitat, degrading our forests for agrarian practices and things like that is contributing to some of these viruses that have been in our ecosystems for a very long time. But now those species are coming out of those ecosystems and that habitat because their habitat's being reduced. and the diseases are cross-pollinating onto, fauna and animals that we eat and things like that. So I think that dialogue really needs to get elevated because it's reciprocal to COVID and climate change.
I want to build on something you just talked about, Heather, because I want to kind of shift our focus a little bit and start talking a little bit about something you mentioned, which is land use planning. Obviously, as we look at what some of the next steps are, especially when we look at infrastructure, Martin, you talked about some of the changes to transportation, water infrastructure. I think we need to talk about, what are those things that as we look at building infrastructure assets going forward, what do we need to do differently? So perhaps, let's start, Heather, with what you just talked about, which is land use planning. When we're building a hospital, when we're building a transportation network, when we're building a transit system, what have you, how do we need to look at something like our land use differently in order to make ourselves more resilient to some sort of disruptive event, be it something medical like a virus, or be it something natural like a flood, hurricane, what have you?
Did you want me to respond or Mark?
Yeah, please. Yeah, I'd like you to start on that if you could.
I think, it's basically a little bit what I said earlier, but just to expand on it, I think that, it's tough in New York City because everything's so dense, but I think what's really opportunistic for sorry, that's my dog. Sorry. He's downstairs and he's still talking, so I put him down there. Sorry, Andrew. He gets vocal about climate change. Hold 1 minute. Okay. So I think that we, in second and third tier cities where there's more natural systems still intact and there's still more green space, I think we need to look really hard at what are those landscape typologies and how we can evolve them into putting in nature-based features, not just hardened shore structures for surge or any other form of water-induced, as well as management of our stormwater. I think stormwater and residual flooding is the sleeping giant. I think there's so much in a watershed that shares the responsibilities for contributing to that issue. And that comes down to even individual houses, where they have a pitched roof or a flat roof. I mean, decisions you make in your yard on whether you bioretain your stormwater. I mean, that's a whole landscape to talk about, what people can do as individuals on their own property. But I think that is really where we have opportunity to grow and work back and forth with each other on really doing that. Let's not degrade so much of our habitat. Let's not lose it. Let's work with it. And I think we need to flip the lens on the word retreat. I don't use the word protect, and I don't use the word retreat. That's funny. And the reason for that is I can't protect people. I can only reduce their level of exposure. And to tell them I'm going to protect them is breaking my trust with them. So I don't use the word protect. Retreat too. I think that we need to flip that lens, and it needs to look at migration. I believe that humans are a part of, not apart from, our natural system. I think we look at things in a very human-centric context. And I think by doing that, we've undermined our ability to live in the natural system. The natural system doesn't need us as a species, generally speaking. I mean, we're really like the invasive species. And so I think if we can kind of take a step back and start to allow our land use and our land planning to reflect that more humble approach to a larger system that's funded by the basic laws of physics and gravity and sediment and everything else, I think we'll be in a better place. But we're gonna have to shift our lens towards working with the system rather than against the system, the natural system.
Okay, thanks, Rory. Martin.
Sorry for the bark.
It's an interesting question, Andrew, because I've worked for years as a volunteer to the Canadian Institute of Planners, being a professional planner myself on their climate change agenda. Commented on their current policy, helped do the first ever adaptation planning in northern communities. It's one of the few that actually have been kind of on the leading edge of climate change. I think similar to Heather, And it's fun being, a planner who's surrounded by engineers trying to figure out the world that we live in. On the matter of land use planning, the thing that I try to remind people about is that is a profit-making business, and don't ever forget it. The people that build buildings do not build buildings because it's fun and because they want to lose money. They build buildings because there's a lot of money in building buildings. There's a lot of money in designing neighborhoods and selling houses. There's a lot of money in building a commercial enterprise and leasing it out. There's a lot of money in building a warehouse on spec for a big operation and them paying you a very large sum of money to do that. And so however we move the bar forward around land use planning, it still has to make economic sense to those that are in the building and design industry. What I've seen in some communities in Canada, specifically in residential construction, is that residential construction took a very brief pause and has continued going with gangbusters. You can go to your local home building center and you will not be able to find very much building material on the shelves of your Home Depot, your Lowe's, or whatever. Those building materials are going directly from the mills to the home builders to keep the home building industry moving forward, because that industry is one of the largest industries in both Canada and the United States. So however we choose to approach land use planning still has to make economic sense there. I can see shifts in how houses are designed. I can see building technology adaptations. I can see shifts in how we approach kind of the organization of land use and those types of things that can actually help us be more resilient. But all of that still needs to fit into a world where someone needs to make a profit.
Right. Martin.
Well, building on what was just said by my two panelist colleagues, we need to switch from a lower bidder environment, cash and carry commodity mindset, where you try to make, well, let's say the best job for the best price, and then get on with it and go to something else, and be mindful of the end of life, and be responsible for end of life of whatever we design. So for doing that, government need to change how they do things, how they put out bids. In many cases, the lower bid rule is how they do things. But well, it could remain as such, but the end of life should be taken into consideration. I believe, and that's building on one of the questions that was asked, 3Ps, the public-private partnership, where taxpayers and governments support the project, but the companies are responsible for delivering and maintaining it until end of life, and even with the disposal at the end of life. That should become the rule, and that will change a lot of things in the way we build roads or sewers or water infrastructure. And I'm going to give you an example. The Canadian government has an infrastructure grant, and through the provinces, it's named differently. In Quebec, it's Transition Énergétique Québec, and within this, there's money for underground infrastructure in particular. And through that program, cities can get grants to renew their network, and in our particular world, it would be water main networks, only if they use advanced technologies, resilient technologies, and in particular trenchless technologies to reduce carbon footprint, environment footprint in general, but more importantly, improve resiliency. And there's a small community on this island of Montreal called the La des Ormeaux, who has renewed almost 50% of their network so far through those grants. And by doing so, they improve the performance of their network by 88%. That's their numbers. Reduce water main leaks, reduced water main breaks by 88%. and that talks big time about resiliency, and that to a lower price, and with improved both performance short term and longer term. This example of that, smaller community should be expanded to New York City or Los Angeles. I mean, they're doing that for some of the transport infrastructure and buildings, in particular for seismic resiliency, earthquake preparedness. But we're seeing jobs of sewers and water mains where it's good old iron pipes and nothing has changed. Like we don't see it; it's not there. So that will I guess it's a common theme of our whole conversation today. Changes need to happen, being mindful of the long term.
So we've got about 25 minutes left in the formal conversation. So just want to encourage everybody once again, if you have a question, please put it in the Ask Question section at the bottom of your screen. As well, you'll see the polls tab at the bottom of your screen. Please take the time to participate in those polls. Like I said, it's valuable information that we can communicate as part of our post-event deliverables. So I just want to continue this conversation with looking at what some of the specific things are that we need to do. And I think, one of the things that we've looked at, especially, and Heather, you touched on, was our healthcare capabilities. Even in some of the places that weren't nearly as hard hit as Montreal, as New York City, we still saw difficulties with testing capacity. We still saw difficulties with hospitals having enough beds to treat COVID patients on top of everyone else that they're having to treat for everyone else. And I'm just wondering, I know that healthcare design is not necessarily expertise for all three of you, but I'm just wondering, from a flexibility of design or perhaps a mobile design perspective, what are some of the at least high level considerations that we need to give when it comes to how we look at the infrastructure for healthcare in Canada and the United States going forward, knowing full well that there could be a second wave that's worse than the first wave? Or Heather, as you suggested, we might get through COVID, but it might only be a number of years before we hit another pandemic. So I'm just curious to hear from all three of you what you think we need to be doing differently in the way we think and the way we approach healthcare infrastructure, both what currently exists, but also what we are looking to build in the future. Not sure who wants to jump in first, but feel free.
I'm happy to. I think there's a good kind of obvious place to begin, which is take a pause and look around your community and ask yourself what public facilities were idle during the lockdown, and what have only just recently come back online. And if we're looking at multi-purpose, multi-use, adaptive use, and investing in existing things, then there's a very kind of low-hanging fruit perspective. I'm not saying that this is the actual solution, but the one that's just around the corner from my house is my local library shut its doors and was absolutely idle for months on end. And I'm a big user of the library, being a dad with a school-age daughter, and I missed it. But if it had been designed from the outset to be multi-purpose, to be a response center for whether or not it was a natural disaster or a health crisis or whatever, that could have kept open and transitioned to its new operational purpose. So I think there are some kind of easy low-hanging fruit right in front of us.
Martin, Heather?
Well, yeah, I will say, it's kind of just to piggyback on what Rory said. I think that multi-purposing is really interesting. I mean, we, even in New York City, in the first phase of opening, they've been able to take parking spaces because there's less vehicular traffic in the city, and allow restaurants to put double outdoor seating because no one can eat indoors yet. And that allowed a lot of restaurants to slowly start to recover from not even being able to, fully function during everything. I think, and for me, at ACOM, I had worked with most of the disciplines that kind of are circled around water and risk management. I didn't even know we had industrial hygienists until COVID. I didn't know a lot of our industrial hygienists had done pandemic responses in different parts of the world. We had an extensive arm in our architecture and building structural engineering practice for healthcare design. What I saw was this whole new dimension of design criteria that entered the scene for that whole group of people. So that was interesting. And then outside of those scales, if I go back to that land planning scale, I think hospital associations and hospitals in local hospitals and regional hospitals need to really formulate from a land planning and asset perspective, do they have the infrastructure from a land planning perspective to handle these pandemics? That was the biggest thing, at least in the New York City region. Like I mentioned earlier, having the space, having the access, can we even get things that we need in there for the life cycle of the disease, or the pandemic, I guess. But that to me is something that there almost needs to be, those of us that deal with emergency operations for coastal surge and hurricanes and stuff like that, we have emergency protocols that are established. We have regional evacuation routes. We have deployable gates, a project I'm leading in Lower Manhattan. We have deployable gates. We have interceptor gates in our DEP stormwater infrastructure that will basically seal the city's comprehensive stormwater system to create individual basins that we can treat depending on the amount of surge that overtops the flood alignments or the amount of rain that comes out of the sky. We have to aggregate a response to pandemics this way. We have to. And we have to start to actually land plan our way through it, because we can't allow ourselves to be so resource strapped in this type of situation again. And then I think the things like putting sensors in our water bodies, putting sensors in our water treatment facilities, that we can see a spike in a virus, or maybe it's a virus no one's seen yet again. Whatever we can do to kind of insulate ourselves with proactive information rather than just reactive, I think we'll be in a safer place.
Martin, I know, Heather talking about water, and that's, where the core of your work is. And it's interesting. She talked about data and sensors. And I know, from the work we do in the water sector, data analysis and sensors is the big topic right now. And we've seen, tracking coronavirus in wastewater. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, I mean, that's got to be a real serious consideration now, knowing full well that this is a virus that we've been able to see in our wastewater resources.
Yeah, well, indeed. And it's becoming a huge opportunity as well, obviously. People will be coming with affordable and solutions that make sense, that makes us more informed, more resilient, less vulnerable to a number of things. Will succeed. Coming back to the questions my colleagues answered, I believe that at our own level, we need to identify the vulnerabilities of our supply, and I mean supply in a very broad sense, whether it's supply of people, workforce, how do we work, a supply of IT. We've become, and this, I mean, we knew that we were relying a lot on those, but now we can't do our job, period, without it, because we're all home. Water, electricity, power. If I was running government, I would spend a lot of money into making sure that power is secured, and water and sewers, for sure. Because the minute you miss those, like, nothing works. They're like, period. Whatever the source of the menace is, whether it's a pandemic or a comet, for what it a rocket from the sky. So yes. Now, embedding sensors, having intelligent sewers, having intelligent water systems that self-cure, self-assess issues, and help us rely less on people. I'm a strong believer into that. So our company is investing a lot for that in particular. The pipeline industry, the oil and gas, for example, as well. And there are also environmental considerations as well. We need to protect the planet. Those new things that we find in sewers, for instance, viruses, are a real issue, and we see that they survive to the plant and beyond. We see a lot as well of emerging contaminants, or I should say contaminants of emerging attention, whether it's lead, old contaminant being newly brought back to media, or other like PFASs or antibiotics that we see in our water. We need to adapt to those and prepare and protect ourselves against. The list of things to be ready for is quite impressive now.
It's
I guess
interesting.
we're young and able to live up to the challenge.
But it's interesting you bring up lead there, Martin, because I think, in the context of the conversation we've been having, we've really focused on pandemic and flood. But, Flint is a perfect example of, another kind of disruptive event that, we also have to be prepared for. It's that wider lens that we need to be able to apply to say, we're not just talking about viruses. We're not just talking about natural disasters. We are talking about things like, the similar, like the Flint lead crisis. So those are the kind of considerations we need to give as well. Sorry, go ahead.
And there's a great example of response to that. So you've got the lead issue in Michigan, and that attracts or that triggers municipalities or states in the US and provinces in Canada becoming aware of their lead lines. Because New Jersey, New York, and I'm not going to list the whole, but there's so many lead lines. Montreal has a program for lead lines. Toronto does as well. And some states do currently. But it's been there for decades without us caring about it. But Flint triggered that. In Canada, we had another unfortunate great example is Waterton in Ontario. And that has actually led to the grant I was talking about earlier, which targeted making water infrastructure more resilient. So we had examples of success stories, let's say, into governments and the whole society responding to it. However, most of the time, people think it's not in my backyard. Like Waterton is fine, or that was a stupid manager decision at Flint. I agree, but we're all humans. We could have disastrous decisions like that throughout the world. Now, this is not an example where there was a mistake, or at least not direct mistake. It's a pandemic. A natural disaster would be the same. So probably that will change our mindset into how we adapt to those and adopt a life cycle analysis approach to everything we do. Might have that brand new, fancy electric car, but when we have 2 million in the road, 2 million of those cars in the road, how do we deal with the batteries? A few is an easy problem. Mm-hmm. 2,000 batteries per year is another problem. Mm-hmm. And we're not ready for those managing those batteries, by the way. So what do we do?
Right. So we've got. Sorry, go ahead, Rory.
There's just another little piece of infrastructure I wanted to make sure we haven't overlooked, and it's one of those ones that throughout this pandemic we've also taken for granted. And that's our information technology infrastructure. That's been key to us being able to stay connected, and for many of us to be able to actually stay employed and keep work going. We have not got to 5G just yet, but certainly I can see COVID might actually give us the ability to accelerate a little bit more to that higher level of mobile broadband, so that we're talking about greater bandwidths. But I think the other thing that's more important is like full coverage across Canada and all of our communities, because even in some urban parts of Canada, service is spotty at best, and we could do more to ensure that every citizen is equitably connected to our IT infrastructure and has the ability to access a wide variety of services through information technology. In particular, one of the things that became super important to us was e-medicine. Finally became real and normal during COVID, and it was a long time coming for Canada. And I'm glad COVID actually forced us to really push into e-medicine. I was able to take advantage of that only a week and a half ago, and let me tell you, it's amazing being able to go to a doctor and get a consult and rely on the fact that I have good IT infrastructure to back that up.
Just a piece of life, a slice of life, as you say. I broke my Achilles ankle tendon just at the onset of the pandemic, and for me, e-medicine was big because I needed some care, and it was simply impossible to go to the hospital for that. So, great example.
Heather, I'm just wondering about the connectivity issue on your end of things. Is it something that you're dealing with, on the other side of the border? Is it something that has come up as part of the dialogue, that this is something that needs greater investment?
Like IT connection?
Yeah.
Yeah, tremendously. We do a lot of environmental impact statement assessment work, and a lot of those types of studies require public response, require public meetings. We had to AECOM invested in a virtual public meeting tool that allows people, again, you only do this if you have really good internet, as Rory and Martin are mentioning. But we've been able to perform EIS public comment meetings. So basically, if you log in, similar to this portal, you're inside a 3D room. And so you can go up to different tables, you can see drawings, you can see a report, you can turn pages through the report. I mean, it is quite impressive. But again, it's like, if you have these resources, you can do these things. So I think the pivot there will be, how do you make these things more available? Rory, your example of the library, I'm back down here in Atlanta, as I mentioned earlier, and I saw a lot of that happening here. The southern landscape, things are more spread out. That's what my dog earlier was barking at a deer. But exactly that, you have these critical public amenities and critical public facilities that if they can pivot and turn, well, what if you could have, people still come to the library and there's a screen outside and people are spaced 6 feet apart and they can see that virtual, EIS room from there. So I just think that, like, in general, we really have to understand what those needs are. And that when we have a crisis like this, and even just in general, people need the access to IT. They need it as a resource, because we're so communicating, we rely on it so heavily, and we're communicating through that medium. And if people don't have access to that, then they're not getting access to so much. Even as Martin, as you said, even when you have a severe injury, how else do you get treatment? Absolutely.
And the way to do that, to achieve the goal, I honestly think, is to bring everyone together, and that's a cliche, into private-public partnerships. I believe that's the way to go. Only government or privatization, I don't believe is the way. Is to use the agility and the long-term and imputability of governments together. Is the way to go.
So we've got about 10 minutes left in the conversation. So I want to package everything we've just talked about to the big question, which is both countries, several $1 billion in infrastructure investments coming down the pipeline in the next weeks, months. in order for us to be ready for the next disruptive event, whether we want to talk about the second or third wave of this, the next flood, fire, pandemic, what have you, what is the real opportunity for government investment to make us more resilient, to ensure that we are not as vulnerable to the next disruptive event, whatever it may be? Who wants to jump on it first? Okay, Heather, you want to jump on it first? Okay, go right ahead.
I think throughout the whole time we've been talking, I hope we've laid out a lot of those different features for that response. But working in the federal system and the scale of risk reduction that the engineers was responsible for, the Corps has about over $3 trillion in assets, and a lot of those assets are high risk assets. So you're talking about high head dams, extensive levee systems, 13,000 miles of levee systems, 710 dams, lots of other things, and hydropower, you name it. And I think that we have to really share the responsibility of risk transfer. So what Martin and Rory are kind of hinting at is that we may build risk reduction in a certain way for Lower Manhattan, in a segment of Lower Manhattan, because that's what that client can afford, right? But if we are then putting features like interceptor gates in New York City DEP's stormwater infrastructure in order to mitigate for rainwater when it's coming as part of the storm, then we're transferring risk to an adjacent sister agency, right? And then in addition, we're requiring New York City DEP to operate and maintain that new asset. And right now, does their yearly budget even allow them to O&M the assets that they already have, let alone all these new interceptor gates, wastewater treatment facilities? So I guess what I'm saying is that everyone uses the words like systems response and stuff like that, and I applaud that. But what surfaced for me is two things. The opportunity lies in you have to have a transdisciplinary response to these problems, meaning that no one single discipline dominates the solution that's manifest. So in a transdisciplinary response, all of the disciplines and all the different angles, stakeholders, whoever it is, communities, they're working towards a coherent whole, right? And so that allows us to look at things fully in a spectrum of dimension that I might not see from my landscape architect, landscape archaeology, and risk dimension, or that brings IT on, or whatever it is that might not be. So it's a transdisciplinary response. Transdisciplinary also is about the actual action of participating with each other, not just, hey, I'm a subject matter expert over here and I'm going to do my thing. And then I'm going to tell you what my summary is, but I'm going to hand it over to you in structural engineering language. So I think in general, we need a new generation of people that are hybrids, people that can move between the different disciplines, communicate, cross-pollinate that information, but come out with a composite answer. So I think transdisciplinary approach for a coherent whole is what we need in order to look at all the added dimension for how much and how vulnerable we are, no matter what the impact is. And then I'm going to piggyback what Martin said. There has to be a combination of a P3 strategy, no matter if it's looking at pandemic response or climate response. There's too much at stake. You can't move fast enough. And I don't think the responsibility should be on one part of that dimension. I think it's going to take all hands on deck, and it's going to take the communities that need the risk communication and the risk education, and that we really are going to have to do this in a much more extensive, collaborative, and concurrent whole as a P3 partnership or P3 landscape, because the responsibility is just too big and you can't move fast enough. So that would be my two things, transdisciplinary and a P3 response.
Thanks, Heather. Rory, Martin, if one of you wants to jump in on it next.
I have a few perspectives from the various kind of years being on the front lines and trying to work with decision makers, the high level. One one of the things that I try to encourage people to look at is see the problem, find the front of pipe solution, not the end of pipe solution. So a lot of stuff that we're doing for COVID right now is all end of pipe solution. So we're self-isolating, and we're talking about vaccines and so on and so forth. But so what was actually the trigger? So the trigger was in regards to a certain pattern of activity that led to a viral mutation that created a virus that was out of control. So can we find front of pipe solutions for the problems that face the Earth? Yes, I think we can. I think we're smart enough as a species to be able to do that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I'll share a concept around resiliency that really struck a chord with a large audience when I did a speaking engagement. And resiliency is like that lone palm tree in the blowing winds of a hurricane. And it will bend, and it'll bend pretty far, but it doesn't necessarily snap. And when the winds die away, the palm tree is still standing. And I think that's something for a community, leaders to think about is we cannot afford to build our way out of our problems. We just simply do not have the financial resources to do it. So we have to allow ourselves to bend in the wind and to recover as quickly as possible. And I think that we can do as through the strengths of our communities, through leadership, and through the actions of individual people. Those for me are really the touchstones, and those are kind of core philosophies that I think can drive really, really positive change for the future and can shape the right type of decision making.
That's a beautifully said, Rory, I must say. Yeah, and in material science, where I come from, resiliency is the capacity of something to absorb energy without breaking. That's exactly what you described. I'd add to what Heather said with a challenge. Now, we'd love that to be global, or at least, no borders, collaborations. While this crisis made it appear very clearly that borders exist between small communities like Montreal, which is an island, versus its South Shore or its North Shore. Like, we don't want Montrealers here; they're sick. So that's going to be a huge challenge to collaborate, address the supply, be self-sustained, having our own chemicals. I salute the move that Eastman Kodak is doing right now. I mean, they're investing into their core competency, chemicals. Like, perhaps 20 years ago they didn't, but now they do. So they decided to address that huge gap. We don't have the chemicals to build our own vaccines or build our own medicines. But that's great. So we'll have to address that, but we'll have to be mindful of borders and adapt to that challenge. And I'm going to be humble, I don't have any idea how to address that, because they're becoming, our borders between, you live in Atlanta, I cannot go to Atlanta visit you, Heather, right now, unless I have a damn good reason. So that'll be a challenge for us. But investing in resiliency will be, and trans competency as a whole is the key.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today's discussion. Martin, Rory, Heather, thank you so very much for joining us today. Really appreciate your input on a very important topic that is not getting discussed enough right now on either side of the border. So thank you to all three of you for joining us. Before we go, just a couple of housekeeping items that I want to address. First of all, if you get a chance, please respond to the polls before you go. You also notice there's a button at the bottom of the screen for the Renew Infra Intelligence series. We have announced the topics for the next 4 conversations. In August, it will be breaking into the market, talking about how contractors and other companies in the infrastructure space break into markets that they are not currently working in. In September, we'll look at whether or not it's time for us to consider putting a price on transportation, help bolster municipal revenues. In October, we'll discuss electrifying the economy and what steps we need to do to get there. And in November, we'll talk about mobility on demand and what that looks like in a post-COVID market. Stay tuned as well. In September, we will be announcing the January to June lineup for 2021 for our Infra Intelligence discussion series. I want to thank all 3 of our panelists, Heather Morgan from AECOM, Rory Baksh from Dillon Consulting, Martin Bureau from Sanexen. Unfortunately, we weren't able to connect John Howe from Wood, who was supposed to join us. Also want to thank a few other people who were instrumental in helping out with today's conversation. Want to thank Andy Manahan from the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario, the Consulting Engineers of Ontario, and the Canadian Institute of Planners for their participation in helping put together today's excellent panel discussion. And of course, we want to thank once again Logistec for their generous support to ensure that today's conversation could happen. And just a reminder that within a few hours from now, you'll be able to once again access the conversation and watch it at any time. Thank you so much for joining us. Look forward to welcoming you back August 27th for our next Infra Intelligence series discussion from Renew Canada. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.